Government is acting, about to install a multi-million-dollar dingo fence in an effort to separate campers and canines.
5,000 kilometre long fence. It's the longest fence in the world. It's longer than the Great Wall of China, but maybe not as well built.
Have you ever heard of a country building thousands of kilometres of fences, not to keep people out, but to stop animals? Doesn't it sound crazy? Yet that's exactly what Australia did. At first, everyone laughed and said it was a waste of time and money. People around the world couldn't believe what happened a few years later. Wait until you hear this story. It will blow your mind and change the way you always see nature. The day the rabbits came, one man had a bad thought that set it off. As early as 1859, a rich settler named Thomas Austin stood on his large property in Victoria, Australia, and let 24 European rabbits roam free. A few bunnies to hunt on the weekends, nothing too important. He thought it would make his new home feel a little more like England. But that small choice turned into one of the worst environmental disasters in history very quickly. Australia was a great place for the rabbits to play. The weather was warm, there was a lot of green, and there weren't many animals that could hurt them. Wild animals like foxes and wolves are not allowed. Within a few seasons, the rabbits did what rabbits always do. They had more babies than anyone thought was possible. By the late 18th century, visitors said they saw whole hills move, not because of wind, but because of bodies constantly moving back and forth. Farmers were shocked to see what they thought was life in the ground. Every few days, each rabbit ate its own weight in plants, leaving behind bare ground that turned to dust in the hot sun. It was hard to believe that the numbers grew from just 12 to hundreds of millions. Crops went away. The pastures fell apart. Rabbits ate all the green things before dawn, leaving the sheep and animals hungry. Every bite the bunnies took meant another dollar lost, another family broken up, and another piece of land turned into sand with no life on it. The harm did not end at the farm gate. The animals that were hungry dug through the roots that used to hold the ground together, which caused a huge amount of erosion. Streams dried up, and areas that used to be fertile became empty. Australia's economy started to fall apart. It was based on sheep, wheat, and cattle. It was like seeing a whole country being eaten alive, one bite at a time. Farmers were desperate and tried everything. They set traps with poison, paid hunters, and even brought in diseases that were meant to kill all the rabbits. It didn't work. The rabbits changed to stay alive, and they kept spreading, even more driven than before. People burned down whole fields to make them hungry, but new burrows were already there when the smoke cleared. The rabbit plague had spread to most of southern Australia by the 1890s. The government saw that this was more than just a bug issue. It was a national emergency. Millions of acres were no longer useful, people were leaving their fields, and the number of animals had dropped off a cliff. Then someone came up with a crazy idea that almost sounded like a joke. Let's build a fence. Not a small fence around a yard, but a line that goes through the middle of nowhere to stop the rabbits from moving west. Not to kill them, but to stop them in their tracks. As early as 1901, work began on what would become the rabbit-proof fence, or the state barrier fence of Western Australia. People pulled rolls of wire and mesh across deserts, plains, salt lakes, and endless red dust, which is some of the roughest land on Earth. To follow a line that seemed to go on forever, they had to deal with heat, flies, and thirst. A lot of people didn't think it would ever work because it was a last-ditch attempt. After all, how could a few metal strings stop an attack that had already eaten up half of the continent? But after the first parts were finished, something strange happened. The West started to breathe again for the first time in decades. The rabbits moved less quickly. Crops began to grow again. Even though the fence didn't solve all of Australia's problems, it did buy them important time. The time when a country learns that building a fence across the wild can either save everything or change it forever. The Great Fence Experiment. The rabbit plague could no longer be stopped by 1901. A lot of furry invaders had eaten through everything, from wild grasses to wheat fields. That year, Western Australia chose to fight back in the strangest way possible. They built a fence instead of poison or guns. This fence wasn't like any other. Plans called for it to be over 1,800 kilometres long, making it one of the biggest things on Earth. It was made of wire and wood. The task was to build a wall that was so long and strong that it would stop the rabbit army from coming into the west. Over 80,000 euros from the government was a huge amount at the time. Some people laughed and said it was crazy, but for the farmers who had seen their land disappear because rabbits had eaten it, it was well worth the money. It wasn't built by engineers in fancy suits. It was built by rough guys with shovels, pliers, and hope. They marched into the middle of nowhere, putting posts into place and unrolling wire mile after mile. The sun was so hot that it could melt steel. The land fought back. The heat of the desert burned people's skin, dust storms made it impossible to see, and overnight, flash floods ate up whole parts of the fence. Slowly, supplies came in the form of camel groups and horse-drawn wagons, moving through the empty space like ghosts on an impossible mission. Every new kilometre made me feel like I had won. In spite of this, fence runners often said it was like following a thin thread across an endless desert. Still, they kept going. And something amazing happened when the last piece was put together. The rabbits kept going for decades, but they finally ran into a wall. The invasion slowed down. It was the first time that crops grew again in Western Australia. The fields turned green, the sheep roamed freely, and the desperate farmers smiled once more. The land that looked like it was lost was once again alive. Even though the fence didn't get rid of the rabbits, it did buy farmers valuable time to heal, rebuild, and hope again. At least for now, Western Australia's risk paid off. The idea quickly caught on after people saw that it worked. Soon, more fences were built across the outback. These were for rabbits, kangaroos, emus, and finally, animals that liked to eat other animals. It looked like Australia had chosen to make survival zones out of the wild. From above, it looked like the continent was made up of wires and pieces of wood that were sewn together. It was hard with each new fence, though. It wasn't just the rabbits that were making trouble anymore. Wild dogs that live in Australia, called dingoes, started attacking animals in the new safe zones. For people who raised sheep, rabbits had eaten the grass, but now dingoes were eating the lambs. There was a need for action. At that time, Australia planned its most daring project yet, a fence so big it would cut through the whole continent, a line that was so long you could see it from above. Not only a wall against animals, but also against nature. It would be known as the Dingo Fence by everyone, and it would quickly grow to be one of the biggest buildings ever built by humans. It would save a lot of money on animals, split ecosystems, and start arguments that are still going on today. The fence that split a continent in two. Then there was a fight with even more people than the rabbits. Sheep had become the main source of income in Australia by the early 19th century. The wealth of the country relied on wool, which was called white gold. But there was a new danger, the dingo, which is Australia's wild dog. Dingoes weren't just a normal part of nature to farms. They were dangerous animals that were stealing their crops and money. Every lost sheep meant lost money, and there were so many of them that it was terrible. It began in the 1880s and was rebuilt and added to in the early 19th century. Eventually, it reached an almost unbelievable length of over 5,600 kilometres, going straight across the continent from Queensland to Cape York in South Australia. Not only was it long, it was huge. Imagine a wall that went from London to Istanbul and back again, cutting through fields, deserts, and cliffs. The Dingo Fence, as it was eventually called, wasn't just a line on a map. It was a statement by people against nature. The building was very rough. The workers had to deal with suffocating dust, scorching heat, and the endless emptiness of the desert. In some places, the path went through rough rock, so each post had to be hammered by hand. Others went through areas that were so big that getting supplies again could take days. There were no towns nearby and no trees to hide in. All that could be heard was the wind and the buzzing of bugs. But kilometre by kilometre, the fence grew until it reached the sky. It was a thin wall of wire. To keep dingoes out, save the sheep, and protect the wool business that kept Australia going is its clear goal. It worked at first. The number of sheep killed by dingoes went down a lot. The amount of wool made went up. Rural towns that were about to fail all of a sudden started doing very well again. The dingo fence wasn't just a building for many farms, it was their only way to stay alive. The fence did more than just keep the sheep safe, though. It split a whole continent in two. It became clear to scientists that the land on either side looked very different. The environment was balanced north and west of the fence, where dingoes still lived. There were fewer kangaroos, more plants, and a more natural rhythm to life. Where the dingoes used to be, south and east of the fence, other predators like foxes and wild cats spread and killed off many small native animals. One side is wild and green, while the other is tamed and pale. You can see the difference even in aerial pictures. It was named the Dingo Line by ecologists. People with wire and drive did nature's big experiment, but it wasn't rivers or mountains that drew the lines. The fence had clearly made two different Australias, which could not be denied. Still, not everyone thought it was a win. The fence was seen as a wound on the Holy Land by the indigenous people who had lived with dingoes for thousands of years. They didn't see dingoes as enemies. They saw them as friends, hunters, and psychic balance. The fence messed up that relationship, turning it from friendly to hostile. That's the strange thing about the dingo fence. What kept the sheep safe hurt the land. By getting rid of one predator, people set off a chain reaction that could not be stopped. Still, the trade-off seemed important for those who relied on their flocks. Fence runners are lone workers who patrol hundreds of kilometers in dusty trucks, fixing holes, tightening wires, and risking storms to keep predators out. The fence is still there today. They live alone, sometimes for weeks at a time, with only the endless desert sky to keep them company. They keep an eye on a delicate balance between order and chaos, between staying alive and giving up. Fencing for the future. In 2010, it looked like the time of big national walls was over. The old rabbit and dingo fences had been there for decades, getting worn down and worn out from fights that had been fought a long time ago. There was a new idea, though, taking form in the dry plains of Queensland. It was smaller, smarter, and more united. It was known as a cluster fence. Instead of building one big fence that went across the whole country, farmers worked together to cover their land with kilometers of wire that keeps animals out. Wild dogs, kangaroos, and stray pigs couldn't get in because each cluster was strong enough to keep them out, but flexible enough that everyone could work together to run things. Rural Australia had never seen such a large group of people work together before. Some people rolled their eyes. Fencing seemed out of date in a time of drones, GPS tracking, and chemical pesticides. They said, "Why spend millions on wire when technology could do the job?" The farmers in the field, though, didn't care about ideas. They were worried about sheep being ripped apart, crops being eaten down to a stump, and people losing their entire way of life. Then the results came out. Within 10 years, the statistics put an end to all doubts. Predator deaths went down by more than 90%. They had twice as many lambs, and the wool quality was better than it had been in decades. It got grassy again, and with it came the sound of sheep grazing happily in the sun, which many farmers thought they'd never hear again. The numbers were enough to tell the story. There were hopes that the dog fence project in South Australia would bring in more than $120 million over 20 years. This would include more jobs, healthier land, and lower costs for pest control. What looked like a risky bet at first was now a brilliant business move. But it had an effect that went far beyond money. Small towns in the country that had been dying out started to come back to life. Jobs came back. The prices of homes went up. Young families came back to the land. There was now pride instead of fear and anger, a quiet belief that working together and being honest still mattered. The land itself started to get better. Grasslands grew back, soil erosion slowed down, and bugs stopped overgrazing so much. One fence line at a time, the environment was slowly getting back to normal. Then something strange happened. Scientists realized that the same ideas that make cluster fences work, making safe areas without predators, could also be used to protect rare species. In places like Scotia Wildlife Sanctuary, fences that kept people out turned into safe havens for local animals that were almost extinct. Wallabies, bettongs, and bilbies started to come back into the protected areas. The idea that caused species to fight was now helping them get back together. The fences that used to mean division were now being used to bring people back together. They were no longer trying to keep nature out. Instead, they wanted to give it space to heal. Because sometimes the answers that seem old are the ones that change the future in a quiet way. The next one is the story of how Australia's fences, which were once seen as crude, led to one of the biggest environmental rescues in modern times. The unexpected miracle. What started out as a last-ditch effort to protect themselves slowly turned into a story of finding. In the huge hot desert, the fences that used to keep animals out were now letting people and animals back in. Scientists started to notice something strange in protected areas like New Haven, Arid Recovery, and Scotia Sanctuary. Local species that had almost gone extinct were coming back. The number of bilbies, bettongs, and wallabies increased again by more than 300% in fenced areas where they felt safe. These walls protected fragile ecosystems without the constant danger of predators, creating living laboratories where they could heal. What used to mean being left out now meant starting over. Australia built biodiversity incubators, which are controlled areas where scientists can study, protect, and release rare species back into the wild without knowing it. The world took notice of the change because it was so amazing. Other countries, like New Zealand, Kenya, and the US, started to use walls to protect their own wildlife that was at risk. A tool that was once laughed at as crude is now used around the world to protect wildlife. The spreading effect was felt in more than just nature. Rural areas that were losing their edge got new life. The fencing projects made jobs available, increased ecotourism, and encouraged academics, local workers, and indigenous rangers to work together. The lines that used to separate land were now connecting neighborhoods. There were still problems, like overgrazing sometimes, high upkeep costs, and the chance of isolating animal populations, but each study showed that the pros were greater than the cons. The ecosystem was getting back to normal as the land healed and animals came back. Then they found out something that shocked even the doubters. What started out as a desperate attempt to protect sheep had turned into one of the most powerful ways to save species in the world. The outback, which used to be a place of question, has become a symbol of strength and new ideas. The walls no longer stood for fear of nature, they stood for people's readiness to learn from it. Australia's walls went from being tools for survival to plans for balance, showing that simple ideas can change the shape of an entire continent with time and effort. And that's how Australia turned fences into frontiers of hope. If you enjoyed this story, hit like, share and subscribe, then click the next video popping up on your screen. You'll love it.